came for the NVAR sales contract training, you're in the right place. Maryland, not the right place. So, all right. So starting off here, this is the latest edition. Hopefully if you got a copy, it's sitting there on the stand there in the middle. Grab one. We're going to start from page 1 and kind of work our way through. Whatever we can get through today, we will. We'll cover the next half next week, same time, same place, 1 week later. So top part of this, when you're filling this out for a potential client to send it in, try and fill this out as completely as possible. Nothing shows your professionalism more than a complete, understandable contract. So fill this out as best as possible. You're filling it out. The top part, of course, is the date of your offer, whatever date you're drafting this offer, between the buyer and the seller. And then you're also going to put in the name of the listing brokerage and the buyer brokerage. So all this stuff on the top part prior to paragraph 1 is all self-explanatory. Please fill it out. If you're a listing agent and you're working with an unrepresented buyer, then the buyer agent would be NA. There would not be a buyer agent. Unless you're acting in a dual agent capacity, then you would put Sampson in there. But if it's unrepresented, NA. Paragraph 1 is real property. Here you're going to fill in the information on your property. It also specifies that the buyer will buy, the seller will sell for the price, sale price and the terms below. Seller entire interest in the property, all their improvements, their rights, their encumbrances, all that kind of stuff. And then you're going to fill this out, this bottom part, the best as possible. Tax ID, subdivision, street address is probably one of the most important parts of here, along with the city and the zip code. Notice there's no state in here. That's because it's a Virginia contract, so no need to put it in there. Paragraph 2 is the price and financing. This is probably one of the paragraphs that normally gets the most questions. So top part is sale price. So whatever your client is making an offer for on the property, you would put that amount in there. Financing, what type of financing are they using? Conventional, VA, FHA, whatever type of financing, you would check the appropriate box, and then you would put in how much they plan to finance. Now, if you see here, you have dollar fields and you have percentages. Try and use all of one or all of the other. Don't use some dollars and some percentages, only because some listing agents kind of miss stuff. We've had a couple cases where people have filled in all the dollars and then the commission part is over on the right, as a percentage. So try and make it as easy as possible on all parties, right? So you're filling in your down payment, your financing amount, whether or not there's a second trust, you would fill that out as well. Or if there's a seller held trust, any type of trust, if applicable. Those are probably very rare. Unless you're financing through the seller, you're not going to have to deal with those type of things. But so otherwise they can just be blank, or you can put zeros in, whichever you prefer. Then the total amount that's financing, either in a dollar amount or a percentage, and try and keep it consistent in regards to that. And then paragraph D is seller subsidy to the buyer, seller's net reduced by. So here, if your client is asking for a subsidy from the seller, that would be the amount that would go in here. And then a lot of people will say, well, what can be used for the seller subsidy? If you look back in the back under the definitions page, it'll tell you, we'll cover that probably next week, but it'll tell you in the definitions paragraph what a seller subsidy is and what is covered under that. Can your buyer agent compensation be covered under a seller subsidy? It could be. So the buyer could ask for a seller subsidy to pay your compensation. However, remember, that's money being floated through your client before it gets to you. So if your client can't pay you and they're doing they can't, but you've done a buyer agency agreement for whatever, and they tell you to do a subsidy, you do it, the money goes to them first, and then they have to tell the settlement company to part of that seller subsidy would go to you. So it's always better to use paragraph 2E for any seller paid buyer compensation, and that would be the amount directly from the seller to the buyer agent or the buyer broker. That way you're going to get paid through this contract from the seller. You could have both, right? The buyer could need a 1% seller subsidy, or maybe you call the listing agent and they say, hey, we're offering 2.5% or 3%, whatever that number is. And your buyer agency agreement is only for 1.5%. You could actually do 1.5% for the buyer agent compensation because that makes you whole in regards to what your buyer agency agreement asks the buyer to pay you. And you could ask for a seller's subsidy for your buyer for 1.5% to equal the 3% that the listing agent told you that they were offering out. If your buyer and that was the decision that you guys chose to do. So we get a lot of questions, about filling out your buyer broker agreement. Shouldn't I fill it out for a higher number in case the sellers? Well, you should fill it out for whatever it is your value is and what you want to get paid. And then if that number happens to be more when you're talking to the listing agent, you could always figure out a way to utilize that if need be. And it would all go in here in paragraph 2. So you could do your compensation and you could do a seller subsidy. You could just do a buyer agent compensation, whichever you choose to do. Any questions on that?
My question is that E, seller payment toward, but buyer broker agreement itself, you say you cannot, last time I asked question, you cannot have range, for instance, 2 to 2.5%. You cannot have range.
Right.
Why not?
Because the NAR settlement says that you can't. It has to be defined.
Defined.
So defined means whatever.
Exact amount.
I mean, a range is not a number. And I've seen them. I mean, I've seen 2 to 3. I've seen 2+. I've seen all kinds of things people are writing in there to try and figure out a way around it.
Can't do it.
I don't mean to say.
So we have to know exact how much.
I don't mean to say it, but we can figure out what our value is and relay that on to our clients. We are a smart people, right? I mean, I think the worry half the time is that we're leaving money on the table, and that's the old philosophy, right? That's the old philosophy. Before, you could be the best agent in the world and the worst agent in the world, and you all got paid the same, right? Now you have to show your value to your client, and that's what you get paid. So whether the listing agent tells you they're offering 27%, whatever your brokerage agreement says, that's what you agreed upon to buy, right? And I don't mean to keep harping on this, but when you hire an electrician or a plumber to come out to your house, right, do you sit there and say, he tells you how much it's going to cost to fix your stuff, right? He doesn't give you a range, right? Well, it depends, right? How much do you got? You make $250,000 a year. Well, my price is higher, right? That's not the way it is, right? So we have to change our mindset a little bit, right? To make sure that we tell our buyers what our value is and put it in our buyer agency agreement. That way, when it goes into the sales contract, whether they're offering 2, 1, 7, whatever, that doesn't matter, right? It only matters what we just thought or what we valued ourselves for and put it into our buyer agent contract, okay?
Sorry, I know that you pretty much just answered this question, but just to be clear, because I have heard mixed, that a buyer broker agreement percentage can be adjusted down, but not up now? Is that what I had
So the
heard?
illustrious Mr. Briggs says that it's okay if you want to draft up your buyer agency agreements to say in the paragraph 8 you put in whatever commission you want to get paid, 2% or 3%. And then in the remarks or other provisions paragraph, you write something in there that says that, as per paragraph 8, however, you're willing to take all the way down to a minimum of X amount of dollars. I would advocate not to do that, but it's okay to do. Mike says it's okay to do. I would advocate not to do it. I mean, back to my contractor guy, if I walked in, if I'm a homeowner and you walked in and said, hey, it's going to cost you $1,500 to get this electrical service done, but I'm willing to take $600. Where would that conversation go eventually, right? I mean, of course, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, the scenario I was thinking is like, let's say you were doing something for your family or a friend and it's at 1%. But there's not a lot of offers, it's not competitive, and the listing agent said they're going to do 2. Well, in theory, I could give that 1% back to my buyer as a credit. So we are leaving money on the table potentially for our client.
So
I
why
know
not,
they don't want us to take it because
really.
we're all greedy realtors these days.
Not really. If you have a listing agent that tells you 2%, you have a buyer agency agreement for 1%, why not put a seller subsidy in this contract?
Because they might not be willing to pay the seller subsidy, but they've already sort of said, the listing agent already said I know it's all net, but that was sort of my thought.
Right.
So we cannot change a buyer broker agreement after ratification to be higher, because according to NVAR's legal
NVAR
blog,
says no.
No, NVAR told me yes. You can
NVAR,
change a buyer broker
somebody's
agreement up
saying
until
no in
settlement.
there, but our philosophy is if you have a brokerage agreement for 1% or 2%, and you make an offer on a property and that number in your contract is lower than that, say it gets negotiated from 2 to 1%, you can now alter your buyer agency agreement to reduce your compensation from 2 to 1%. Right. I would recommend that you do it property specific in the brokerage representation agreement amendment that says I'm reducing my compensation from 2 to 1% for property at 123 Main Street. That way, if buyer decides they're going to void that contract, then you go back to the original agreement in your buyer agency agreement.
But you can't go from 1 to 2.
Sure, you can.
Oh, okay. Lynn Hamilton had
if
had
you
a
can
class
drop
that told us
it,
we were
if you
not
can reduce
allowed
it,
to
you
go
can
up.
surely raise it.
Okay,
There
I had
are
gotten different
associations
information.
out there that saying that once you have an agreement in place, you can't alter that agreement whatsoever. Which
NVAR told me yes.
I'm going to say, if you can alter it down, you can alter it up.
Did you have one?
You can't say you can only alter it down, right? You can alter it in whatever direction needs to be. I mean, I don't know as a buyer, if I agreed if you agreed to do a deal with me for 1%, and then later on when we're writing an offer on there, you come back to me and say, hey, Steve, or I go to you and say, hey, I need to raise my buyer agent compensation from 1 to 2 because they're offering 2, and, I'd like to collect that because, I got 2 kids in diapers and, I need the money, honey, right? I mean, that might not go over very well, right? So I mean, if you've got specific stuff where you're working for a family member or whatever, and they're very amenable to changes, then feel free to do what you need to do for those family members as long as they agree. But I think you're going to be hard-pressed to move that number up and down based on the characteristics of a buyer, right? I mean, but it's different. So say I sign a 2-month or 3-month buyer agent contract with you at 1%. Oh, Steve, I know exactly what I want. We're going to go out there. We're going to find something. We're going to buy it. We're done, right? Let's do it at 1%. Okay, let's do it. So 2 or 3 months later, we're still out looking, right? Well, we got to renegotiate this now, right? At the end of the period, I'm not just going to extend them for another 2 months. I'm going to say, dude, I've showed you 65 houses. We've written 17 offers, which you've voided 10 of them. I mean, I need to jack my rate up here, right? Yeah. So, you have the ability to make alterations to the agreement as you need be, whether that's at the time of expiration or prior to, right? So, any questions that lead into this contract? Yes, ma'am.
I just have the question is, but what you're saying, I just want to clarify too. So if I say I want to be, I'm charging my folks a 3% amount, and they can only, when it comes down to it, they can only afford maybe 2.5 because the seller's offering 2 and they could do the half. That's okay, or do I have to change it for that too to say 2.5?
If your buyer agent,
If our buyer agency agreement says 3%, but then the buyer finds out the seller can only pay 2 and they can only afford 0.5%, do I have to change the buyer agreement, or can I leave it
Yes.
that way and accept the?
yeah, because the title company is going to ask you for if any money is coming from the buyer, the title company is going to ask for a copy of your buyer agency agreement.
That's what my other question was going to be: is how
So-
are they going to know? Like, if the seller can't pay you, how
Right.
does the settlement company know you're still due this amount of money?
Yeah. So anytime your buyer is contributing to the commission, the title company or the lender is going to ask you for a copy of your brokerage agreement. So you're going to need, if you have a brokerage agreement for 3% and you were able to get in your contract 2%, and there's still 1% left out there, whether you negotiate 0.5% or however you do that, you would want to do that in a brokerage representation agreement amendment.
Okay.
And then attach that to your thing and send it over. That way all parties understand how the commission structure is going to be.
And does the lender are they limited how much subsidy the buyer can get still, or
Sure.
they do limit how much they can get?
Sure, every loan program is going to limit what subsidy or what the buyer's payouts can be, right? Mm-hmm. Or what the amount of money that's coming in to the buyer as a subsidy could be. So, yeah, there's still those restrictions, and what you would want to know those before you start writing offers. So you don't want to write an offer. You don't want to write an offer for, whatever, a 3% seller subsidy to find out this particular loan program will only allow 1 or 1.5.
Right. That's why I didn't know if they changed it or not. I hadn't heard.
No, I
so.
don't think lending rules haven't really changed. The only rule that hasn't changed is that they now allow commission to be paid by the buyer, right? So before, the lenders wouldn't allow that.
Well, I know our lenders here can give a 1%, but the buyer might get a higher interest rate, is what they said last time I went to the last class, like a week ago.
Any program they could all, it depends on the program that they're in.
Okay, those are my questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Page 2, appraisal contingency. So this contract is or is not contingent on an appraisal. If contract is contingent on financing and or appraisal, seller will provide appraiser reasonable access to the property for appraisal purposes. If contract is not contingent on financing and or appraiser, the seller will or will not provide appraiser reasonable access. So if you're not contingent on financing, make sure you check the appropriate box here so that you can get access for your appraiser to get into the property to do the appraisal, right? So if contract is not contingent on appraisal, buyer will proceed to settlement without regards to the appraiser. Seller and buyer authorize broker to release the sale price to appraisers who contact them to obtain the information. Nothing in this subparagraph creates a financing contingency, so you make sure that you have the appropriate addendum attached to your contract for your financing contingency, right? So on those, you're checking the appropriate boxes. Same for paragraph H, buyer representation, whether or not the buyer will or will not occupy the property. This is specifically needed by your lender. The lender, when they review this contract, is going to look at that paragraph because the interest rate on the loan could vary depending on whether or not they're going to live in the property or not. Paragraph 3 is your deposit paragraph. The deposit. Here's the section we would fill out in regards to any earnest money deposit. the buyer's deposit in the amount of whatever. So you're going to check the box. So say they're going to wire it, or they're going to give you a check, or they're going to give you a check and you're going to deposit it via Zachem. So you would check the box and then you put whatever that amount is. Or if they're going to do a note payable on whatever that is. So say they don't have the cash on hand right now, they're going to do a note. You would fill that particular section out. And in most cases, you want to do. I mean, the more deposit you put in here for your buyer, the better your contract looks sometimes. So I would say in most cases, you would want to do a minimum of 1% of the sale price as a general rule of thumb. But if you're competing against other offers and you're trying to make your client's offer look a little better, sometimes a higher deposit, earnest money deposit, could squeak that over the edge for you. So you would fill that section out, and then you have to check a box whether it's going to be the settlement agent or the buyer's broker or other who is holding that amount. Sampson's policy is that you deposit with Sampson and not the title company. The reason being is because a brokerage follows different rules than a settlement company. Settlement company follows the rules under the Board of Insurance. Sampson follows the rules from DPOR. So if the underlying reason really as a buyer, if your buyer voids a contract, and this happens more than you would think, your buyer voids a contract and the seller refuses to sign the release of contract and deposit. For whatever reason, they got up in the wrong side of the bed, they've just decided they're not going to sign it, so that money is just going to sit there, okay? If you deposit that money with Sampson and you voided and a broker determines that you voided the contract for reasons that you had in the contract, the broker can send a letter to the seller that says, our client voided had the right to void. If you don't protest, we're going to release this money in 15 days. And then at the end, if we don't receive a protest back, we can release that money. Settlement company can't do that. That money is going to sit there until both parties agree to its disposition. So it's up to you on how you want to protect your buyer, but our company policy is in place to help our clients. So I would recommend that you try and utilize that aspect if you can, because believe it or not, it does happen more than you would think. All right, so, and then the buyer has delivered or will deliver deposit to the escrow by X amount of business days. So if you notice from previous editions, it was just days. Now it's been defined as business days. So that would be however many business days that you need to have that escrow deposited by. If the buyer fails to complete or fails to timely deliver the escrow as to the agent as provided, the seller may, at seller's option, deliver to the buyer notice to void the contract. Upon delivery of the seller notice to void the contract, all respective rights and obligations of the parties arising under the contract will be terminated. However, the buyer may cure the default by delivering deposit to escrow agent prior to the seller delivery of notice voiding the contract. So if I have a buyer and my buyer client hasn't made delivery, say it's 3 days, hasn't made delivery of that earnest money deposit within that 3-day period of time, I am obligated under the Code of Ethics and DPOR regulations to notify the other side that my buyer client has not made the earnest money deposit as outlined in the contract. What happens if you don't do that as the buyer agent, right? If they wanted to, they could write you up on a Code of Ethics violation, or they could send in a notification to DPOR, right? So you want to make sure that you're transparent with the other side when it comes to earnest money. Secrets are not a good deal, right? So if you notify the other side and you tell your buyer, we haven't delivered within the 3 days required here in the contract, the seller could serve us notice and void this contract. As soon as we receive that notice, this contract is dead. I recommend you get this money in as quickly as possible, okay? Hopefully they do, but if they don't, the seller and the listing agent could turn around and send over a notice to you telling you the earnest money deposit hasn't been delivered as outlined in the contract. This contract is now void. Your buyer's done. That's it. Over, right? So make sure that your buyer client, does what they're supposed to do under the contract. There could be reasons why they're not making the earnest money deposit, and it happens all the time. I've heard a million of them. We want to get through the home inspection before we deliver the earnest money deposit. We want to get through this before we do that. It's a contractual. If you know that that's the way you're going to do it, you're going to try and hold the earnest money deposit until you get your home inspection done. Make those days longer, okay? The seller may not agree to 5 days or 7 days or 27 days or whatever that number in there, but if that's your strategy, then I would ask for the number of days. Why put your buyer in a position to, number one, not make the deposit, number two, have to disclose that the deposit hasn't been made to the listing agent, and then put your buyer, they just got their dream house, right? To be voided and kicked out of that house in 4 days later, right? So in a hot market, you may find that those type of things will happen. On a slower market, maybe not so much, but just be cognizant of that fact. And then I'm going to hit the next topic, which comes up all the time, right? So that money, when you make the deposit, you have your client put $25,000 in earnest money deposit in escrow, okay? It's sitting there, okay? There's only 4 ways that money can, other than what I just told you about the broker, right? But there's only 4 ways that money can get dispersed, right? It can be credited towards the sale price at settlement. 2, all parties have agreed in writing as to its disposition, i.e. a release, right? A court of competent jurisdiction orders disbursement and all appeal periods have expired. Or 4, dispose of in any other manner authorized by law. Those are the only 4 ways that earnest money deposits can be dispersed. So you have a buyer client or you have a listing and something happens and it's going to default, and people call and they say, hey, my client, they didn't settle on Friday, my client just wants the earnest money deposit. How long does it take to get that money sent over to my client? Nowhere in here does it say contract goes into default, seller automatically gets EMD. So only those 4 ways that I just described are the only ways that the money can be dispersed either back to the buyer or to the seller. So if your contract goes into default status, there's a whole section on default, right? That's another paragraph. So remember, when your seller and you are thinking about what you're going to do with a particular buyer, and you get to the settlement and they can't settle for whatever reason, they need 1 more day or 2 more days for whatever reason, okay? Try and be the voice of reason, right? Our sellers a lot of time do what we suggest or what we recommend, or they take on our roles or personalities sometimes in these times, right? So if everything's going smoothly and you get to the point at the end where the lender needs an extra day or 2, okay? Try and work it so that everybody can figure out a way to get to settlement. We get calls, Mike and I, I'm sure all the brokers get calls all the time. Well, they can't settle today. They can't settle. Today is Tuesday. They can't settle until Thursday. My client wants $1,000 a day for delay. Okay? Is that really reasonable? No. Right? I always look at it at a perspective as well. The Virginia Association of Realtor contract says on or about. The way theirs are listed, on or about. That means they give buyers and sellers a little grace period in regards to when the settlement is supposed to occur. Virginia Association or Northern Virginia Association of Realtors are very specific, right? And it says on or before, or so if you go past that date, everybody gets their nails out, right? They're ready to fight, right? Try and be the voice of reason here to kind of keep the deal going, right? Which leads me into paragraph 4, which is our settlement paragraph, right? So the buyer and seller will make full settlement in accordance with the terms of the contract on or with mutual consent before, and whatever that date would be. That's not TBD. You should put a date in there. Even if you're doing a short sale and you don't know, do a timeline in your brain that says, okay, it's going to take, it's going to probably take 60 days to get through the short sale process at a minimum, then another 30 days to close. That's 90 days. It's always better to have a date in here than to leave it as TBD or blank or whatever. So make sure you fill that in. If settlement date falls on a day other than a business day, then settlement will be on the prior business day. So it doesn't give an automatic extension. It says it's supposed to be before. Then you have your paragraph for notice to buyers regarding the Real Estate Settlement Act. So this is letting the buyer know that they have their choice of settlement companies and they get to choose the settlement agent. So here is my pitch for Cardinal Title, right? The wheels on the bus go round and round, right? Well, the wheels on the bus here go round and round because of Cardinal Title, right? You think we keep the lights on at $395 for the $395 fee? No, right? So if you have a buyer, try and get them, talk to them about Cardinal Title. I have nothing but good experiences with Cardinal Title. Hopefully that is the most of the group. Okay, yeah, there are hitches here and there, I will agree. But a lot of times, sometimes the hitches go because of us, right? Sometimes. Like, I'm on top of them all the time. Like I use Qualia and I'm emailing back and forth with the processor constantly regarding stuff. Hey, where are we here? Do you need this? What's going on here? Blah, 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 blah. So I'm interactive, right? You should be too, no matter what title company you're using, but my pitch would be for Cardinal Title.
Steve?
Yeah.
I have a question on 4 on the settlement.
Yeah.
Can you just explain why? I've always been told we do need to get an addendum if, with mutual consent, we settle before
Right.
the contractual settlement date. But since it's already in here saying it's okay, we just need to document the mutual consent? Is that why
Most
we
of
need
the time
to do
it's
the
a
addendum?
settlement company and the lender that are asking for another document.
Okay.
I mean, in reality, by the contract, it says, well, what is considered mutual consent? Okay? Sometimes you can tighten these contracts up a little bit and maybe define what mutual consent would be. Is mutual consent I sign and you sign? How is that consent defined, right? So a lot of times a lender or the settlement company is going to ask for the addendum that moves settlement up 2 days or 5 days or whatever, just because mutual consent is not defined. And the only way to define it is by both parties signing an addendum that says that they both agree to move the settlement date to that date, right? Huh?
In terms of new homes, the builders require, most of them have their own settlement companies.
Yep.
What are we supposed to do on that case?
I would say you need to do what's in the best interest of your client, right? So a lot of times builders will put incentives in there for using their lender and their settlement company. I would say if it's going to jeopardize your buyer's, $20,000 finished basement rebuild or whatever, to settle with their title company, you have to do what's in the best interest. Your client has to do what's in the best interest of them, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So, I mean, and the same holds true when you're making an offer with multiple offers on a resale property, and the listing agent is telling you, "Oh, we want to go here." the seller really wants to go here. And so you might have to or need to draft your offer in a fashion that makes your offer competitive by putting a different title company in there in order to win the bid. That doesn't mean after you get ratified that you can't switch it to Cardinal Title if that's what buyer wants to do. You could do that, but yeah, no, you have to do what's in the best interests of your buyers, of course.
Yeah, but legally, the lenders, the builders cannot force you to
Correct.
to
I mean,
go
you
with
could.
their.
You could take it to Cardinal Title.
They cannot tell you, no, we don't sell it to you if you don't.
They cannot.
Okay. Thank you.
Steve, I just had a quick question. Years ago, it used to be that the buyer and the seller could use different title companies to settle. And then a new rule or law came about that said, no, everybody had to use like the same one. But then there were variations to that. Like perhaps the seller can use a different one if it's, I think, a law firm or something.
Yes.
But I'm not really clear on when it's okay to do different title companies, if you will.
For clarity, it was never a new law. It was just an enforcement of what was out there. So Virginia is a title state, right? So that's how we get the liberty, and it's a way to keep the cost down for the buyers instead of attorneys. In a lot of other states, New Jersey, North Carolina, in order to sell real estate, it has to be done by attorneys, right? So in Virginia, they allow settlement companies, which the settlement agents aren't always attorneys, right? I mean, there's normally an attorney at the settlement company that reviews the documents, prepares the deed, that kind of stuff, but they're not always the ones that are running the settlement, right, all the time. So in Virginia, right, if the buyer chooses, say, Cardinal Title, and the seller chooses to go somewhere else, theoretically, by the letter of the law, they're supposed to designate an attorney, right, as their settlement processor. So, and unfortunately for us, right, Cardinal has decided as a business that they don't want to do business under their attorneys' names. So that's why we can't bring the seller over to Cardinal, because Cardinal has made a decision that they don't want to say put their attorney's name as the because it's not really a law office. But some settlement companies do have separate attorneys that are running real estate law offices within those settlement companies. So when you're breaking out like that, you can still do a split settlement. However, theoretically, they're supposed to both be attorneys. All right. Buyer notice to seller. Buyer designates, and here's where you would put in whatever title company that you would want to put in there. Okay. Once again, I highly recommend do not put TBD. Make sure you fill this in. Buyer agrees to contact the settlement agent within 10 days of date of ratification to schedule settlement. And then it goes on to say what the title company is going to do and all that kind of stuff. But the key one here is make sure that you or your buyer or the settlement agent is notified within that 10 days so that they can start the process of closing the property out. You would think that would never happen, right? But it does, trust me. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in here in writing. They wouldn't write it in here if it doesn't happen. So there's certain things that take a certain amount of time, and if you don't notify the settlement company early enough in the process, you could potentially delay your settlement, which could also cause your buyer to be in default, right? If you can't meet the settlement date, right? So make sure that you do that, and we as agents, right, make sure that we are either making it happen or we are facilitating whatever needs to happen. Number 5 is a down payment. This just lets the buyer know that they have to come up with the down payment at settlement. And paragraph 6 is your delivery paragraph. So this paragraph sets up where do you want documents and communication to go between your buyer and your seller during the transaction, right? So here it sets it up in paragraph 6, right, for either the seller or the buyer's agent and how they want communications to be delivered. Now, this is just normal communications back and forth, home inspections, those type of things, right? So however you want that, whether that's you personally as your email address, or you want you and your client's email addresses in here, and you want that information sent, emailed back and forth, I've seen it several different ways. So me personally, I'm a control freak, so I like to be in control. So I put my email address only because I don't want communications going to the buyer directly or the seller, right? I want to be that conduit. They're paying me big bucks. So I want to be the conduit for all things real estate to my client. But some people, for whatever reason, may put their client's information in there, right? I mean, we have a lot of international people here that travel extensively throughout the world. If you're working and you're putting a buyer contract together, and you may consider putting your client's email address in there because you might be traveling, you might be out of the country, you might have bad internet service, who knows? But those might be reasons why you might put your client's information, or if you have a backup. Like, I know I'm going out of town for the next 2 weeks. My service is going to be intermittent. I've talked to VIPS, and VIPS is going to back me up while I'm gone, so I'm going to put VIPS's email address in there, so all communications not only go to me, they go to VIPS as well. So just some things to think about when you're filling this section out. Also, it's good to fill it out for the other side. I always put in, when I'm filling this out for my buyer, I always put the seller's the listing agent's email address in that slot already. If they want to add in someone else, they can, but at least it starts off with their email address. Let's go, paragraph 8. So, but that's the way I would do it. You can do it any way you want, but I like to be in control. I like it to filter through agents. I don't want the seller, the listing agent, contacting my client directly for whatever reason, right? Paragraph 7 is your Virginia Residential Property Disclosure Act. It's just saying that the Virginia Property Disclosure Act requires seller to deliver a disclosure statement prior to the acceptance of the contract unless the transfer of the property is exempt. The law requires seller on a disclosure statement provided by the real estate board to state the seller makes no representation or warranties concerning the physical condition of the property and to sell the property as is, except as otherwise agreed to in the contract. So make sure as the buyer agent, you're not filling out the property disclosure without the seller's signature on it before you send it in. So if I go through the documents section of the listing and I go in there and there's no disclosure statement, I may text the listing agent and say, hey, we're getting ready to write an offer, but I notice there's no property disclosure statement in your documents section. Could you please send me over a signed one by your sellers? If they don't, I send over my contract without it, right? So it's still a requirement. They'll need to fulfill it, but it's not. I'm not going to have my client sign it before the seller signs it because they're the one actually making the disclosure. Yes, ma'am.
On that, like on the exemptions, I was always told if they've never lived in that property, they don't have to fill that out.
Well, there are 11 exemptions.
Yes, and I looked them up, and
Yep.
But I was still like, I had somebody that inherited a property, never lived there, and I was still told I had to have them fill that out, and I'm like, that didn't make sense to me because
Who told you that?
Yes, the
Transaction review.
yes.
So
Yeah, so I had her do it because she was a friend of mine. I was like, just fill this out so we can get this into them. But I said, normally you shouldn't have to fill the DPOR, and banks that are foreclosed or short sales don't have to do it.
I'm going to let you in on a little trick.
Okay.
So you guys are all here today, right? You guys, I'm going to let you in on a little trick. The people that are reviewing SkySlope are not real estate agents, okay? They're trained to look over your file and to make sure that you have what they consider the required documents that are set up for probably 85 to 90% of the transactions. So if I have a transaction on a home that is new construction or exempt from the DPOR requirement for a property disclosure statement, then when I'm filling out my checklist, there's a note box right there. I would write in there and say, DPOR residential property disclosure statement is not required. Home is new construction. And then that's what I would write in there, and I wouldn't worry about it anymore from there.
Okay, I just want to make sure because, like I said, I always was under the understanding
Right.
if somebody's never lived in that house,
Right. But they don't know.
Right.
They're just
but they wouldn't. Yeah. Okay. Now I'll just put that in.
but
there
they're just going back to you. You're not attaching a disclosure. They're just going back to you and say, hey, you need a disclosure statement.
I tried to explain that to him, but I kept getting told I needed that, so I was
Right.
like, screw it, just put it in there.
Well, you can do like the all the other people here when they have issues with sky slope review. They contact Mike, myself, Dave Werfel, and they say, hey, I'm having this issue. Can you help me out? And we'll put the note in there, and we'll all move forward. But in most cases, and this happens also with like MLS listing data. So if your client is buying a property and it's not in the MLS, okay? Well, one of the items in the checklist is for a MLS listing, right? Well, if it's not in the MLS, there isn't one, okay? The reviewers are just looking at that box and telling you that you need an MLS listing. Well, all you had to do is put a note in there that says, this property was off market, there was not in the MLS, no MLS listing to upload. And you'll move on from that. It may show X for a long period of time. Now, the other secret with SkySlope is if you don't upload an attachment to your file, they don't know it needs to be reviewed. So say they go through your checklist and 2 items are checked X because there's no MLS agreement and there's no property disclosure statement. And you just put notes in there. And now you're waiting for them to review it. Unless you upload a document somewhere, they're not going to know. So a lot of times what I'll do is I will write on a piece of paper, no MLS listing. I'll scan it in, I'll upload it into the checklist, and voila, everything gets done and approved, right? So you get a couple tricks here today, right? A couple tricks of the trades if you play around with SkySlope enough, right? So remember, you can write those notes in there, but if you're writing notes in and didn't upload any additional documents, you'll need to put something in there, write it on a piece of paper, scan it in, take a picture of it with your phone, whatever. Upload something that says, you're doing a fabulous job, I love you, thank you for approving my file. Okay, whatever. All right, paragraph 8 is your Virginia Resale Disclosure Act. Here it's changed a little bit from past years. The seller represents that the property is or is not located within a development that is subject to the Virginia Property Owners Association Act. Seller represents that the property is or is not within the development that is subject to the Virginia Condominium Act. So they incorporated both into one, so you have one for both now. So whether or not it is part of a property owners association and whether or not it's part of the Virginia Condominium Act, yes or no. It could be both, right? We do have properties here that are part of an association and part of a condominium. So with that, we're just informing everybody that, hey, there's a Virginia Disclosure Act, the contract for the resale of the property, and that the buyer has certain obligations and rights and responsibilities regarding the review of that disclosure package. So the buyer is allowed to cancel the contract under the following circumstances. 1, X amount of days after ratification of the contract if the purchaser receives the resale certificate, whether or not complete, or a notice that the resale certificate is unavailable, or before the date that the contract is ratified. So now you can put a number in here and it doesn't have to be 3. So you could put 2, you could put 1, you could put 0, you could do whatever you want. So, and then 2 is within X amount of days from the date of the purchaser receiving the package, whether or not complete, or notice that the resale certificate is unavailable if delivery occurs after contract is ratified, or number 3, at any time prior to settlement if the resale certificate is not delivered to the purchaser. If time frames in this paragraph are left blank, the default is 3 days. So here now you get to denote for your buyer how many days this contract, the contingency for this particular provision is defined. It could be, if you leave it blank, it could be 3 days. You could write in 3 days. I would say if you're planning on 3 days, write it in, don't leave it blank. You could, if you're trying to make your contract more attractive, you could do a lower day. Some people have done 0, but that does not remove the requirement from the seller to provide the documentation to the buyer, right? So it's still a law, Virginia law, that it's required that the buyer gets the right to review the package. Now, however, you can reduce that contingency down or extend it. You could do, your buyer is going out of of course, the property they want always comes on right before they go out of town, right? Or right before you go out of town. So you could do this up for a longer period of time, knowing that your client is going to be out of town for 7 days. And you're most likely, in most cases, most listing agents are going to deliver that on the day of ratification. So you could put in there 7 days, or you could put in there 10 days, whatever that number is. It's a negotiable item too, right? I, as a listing agent, may look at this and say, I'm not giving them 7 days to look at that. I'm not giving them 27 days to look at that. So it's a negotiable item now. So it could go back and forth. So in here, right, so now you have the delivery of the resale certificate or the notice of non-availability of the certificate. The buyer prefers delivery at, if electronic, or if hard copy, right? So here is where you might want to put your client's information, right, their email address. Because now we're specifically talking only about the resale certificate. So just the other day, I'm not calling anybody out because they're not here, but just the other day, somebody got the resale certificate and it went to their spam folder. 5 days later, they called the listing agent and they said, hey, we haven't received the HOA package yet. What do you mean? I sent it. They found it in their spam folder. 5 days it had been sitting in there, okay? The call is, Steve, how many days do we get to review the HOA package? I said, what'd you have in your contract? 3 days. I said 3 days from the date that thing landed in your spam folder. You can ask the listing agent for more time. You can try and finagle it and go back to them and say, delivery received, and date it today, and see if they bite off on it. But by the letter of the law, right, delivery occurred already, 5 days. What if that person had it set up that it went to his email address and to his client's email address? Less chance of at least now, he doesn't have, at least if that happened, he doesn't have to call his client and say, well, it went to my spam folder, how about you, right? If it went to both their spam folders, then they're both at fault. But now the buyer's got to say, well, or the buyer agent's got to say, well, we're kind of, you get to review it, but I hope everything is okay and you're not going to have a problem with it, because now there could be potentially an issue, right? So it is better to have some backup in there in regards to this, okay? All right, so that is the resale package. Paragraph 9 is property maintenance and condition inspection. So here is where if you're going to do a home inspection or not. If you're going to do a home inspection on here, you're going to check the appropriate boxes. I am going to do a home inspection. What's the time frame that I'm going to use for making this property in virtually the same condition as of whatever that date is? So in my case, I'm doing a home inspection, so I'm going to check the box for home inspection. If I wasn't doing a home inspection, I would probably check the box as date of offer. So that way they're going to convey the property in substantially the same condition as of the date of the offer. Even if I'm doing a home inspection for informational purposes, I still want to check the box for home inspection, whether or not it's contingent. That has nothing to do with it. I will tell you, however, though, if you check date of offer and you're not doing a home inspection, when you do the walkthrough prior to settlement and there's any issues, without a home inspection report, you virtually have no baseline. So I've talked to a couple people over the last, over the years or whatever, and some of the things, if you're writing non-contingent offers and not doing home inspections, it could be in your best interest to do a little video on your cell phone. When you're walking through the property with your client and you know they're going to write an offer, take a little video through the house for your own file, okay? Sinks, no drips, toilets working, no water leaks, no water leaks in the ceiling. Try and do a little self-guided tour, 10 or 15 minute thing on your phone. Save that video. You do your walkthrough, you go through, you're like, okay, this toilet is running continuously when you flush it, right? You can hear it when you walk in the house, whatever. The seller comes back and says, the listing agent comes back and says, well, you guys didn't do a home inspection. That toilet's been like that forever. Oh, well, really? Well, I've got a video right here that says that it isn't, right? So the seller needs to fix that, please. So without any video or any type of proof, the onus is on the buyer to prove that the items are different than when they were at the date of the walkthrough or the date of the offer. So little things that you can do as buyer's agents to keep your clients out of harm's way. So you continue on and you're going to put in here, say, the date of the home inspection, and you're going to say, okay, whether or not this contract is contingent on a home inspection, or your buyer waives the opportunity to make it contingent on a home inspection. If the contract is contingent on a home inspection and or inspections of the property, the seller will provide broker, buyer, and inspectors retained by the buyer reasonable access to the property to conduct home inspection and or other inspections of the property. So just because it says home inspection, it's any inspection that your buyer needs to do during this time period. So you could, whether you're bringing in a home inspector. One time I had a listing, and a lot of times I try and go by when they're doing their home inspection. And I got there and there was an HVAC contractor, there was a roofer, there was some kind of somebody else, and a home inspector. There were like 4 people like ants roaming around this house. I was like, holy cow, right? So, but they had the right under the contract to have the house inspected, and they could do whatever they want. Like a lot of people now are doing a sewer line inspection during this period of time because a home inspector doesn't do that type of stuff, right? They run the faucets. Yeah, the drains in the house don't work, but whatever. But they're running cameras down the sewer lines, an added protection for the buyer, right? So make sure your buyer knows the potential things that they can do, so that way when they move into their house and 6 weeks after they move in, the toilet's all back up, you have suggested, they can do whatever they want, but you have suggested different inspections for them to do, and make sure that they understand what a home inspection is, right? A home inspection is a non-invasive look over the house. It's not going to tell them a lot of things about the house. So make sure you provide a plethora of things that you can offer your buyers so that their future investment is protected. If the contract is not contingent on a home inspection and or inspections of the property, the seller will not provide access to anyone for the purpose of conducting an inspection, except for the walkthrough inspections, as provided below. However, if I check seller will provide broker, buyer, and a licensed professional insured inspector retained by the buyer reasonable access to the property to conduct a home inspection and or other inspections on the property between, and I would fill in these dates. So if I'm going to do an inspection that's non-contingent, but theoretically for informational purposes, I don't need a full addendum for a home inspection radon contingency. All I need to do is put in dates here for when we're actually going to perform this inspection for informational purposes only. Now, there's a couple strategies, right? You're competing against other people. You want to do a home inspection, but you don't want to make it contingent. But hey, it's in a homeowners association, so you can theoretically, if you do your home inspection within the first 5 days, there's a possibility that you might be able to get your inspection done before your HOA review period expires. So you might try and do that. Well, a savvy listing agent is going to know these type of things, right? So they may come back and say, hey, we'll allow you to do the home inspection for informational purposes. However, you can't do that inspection until today's the 7th, tomorrow's the whatever. You can't do your inspection until the 12th, and we'll give you, 7 days to do it, but between the 12th and the 19th. Now I know as the listing agent, my HOA review period has ended. You didn't just sneak a home inspection in under a contingency versus, me not allowing it, right? So, but hey, a not so savvy listing agent, you could probably get away with it, right? So regardless of whether the contract is contingent upon a home inspection and or inspections, the seller will provide broker and buyer reasonable access to the property to make their walkthrough inspections within 7 days prior to settlement and or occupancy, okay? So the contract already says that the buyer can do their walkthrough within 7 days to the settlement, okay? Does that mean I can call you up as a listing agent and say, hey, my client wants to come in on the 10th? No ands, if, or buts about it. We want to come in on the 10th. I come back to you and I say, hey, my seller's moving out on the 10th. We would prefer that you do it on a different day. No, I'm doing it on the 10th. You have to allow me to do it on the 10th because it's within that 7-day period of time. Well, yes, it is within the 7-day period of time, but it still is the seller's property. So work with the seller, work with the buyer, make sure that you guys coordinate, in order to do these things, right? I mean, I could come back and say, hey, seeing that my clients are going out of town that weekend, is there a way we can do it on Friday and then we can slide by on Monday right before settlement to just do a walkthrough after they get their stuff out? Figure out ways to negotiate your way through this stuff. Don't draw lines in the sand, right? The best way to do it is to communicate with the other side. All right, possession date. Unless otherwise agreed to in writing between the seller and the buyer, seller will give possession of the property at settlement. So the property conveys at settlement, right? So just because if we settle on a Friday and maybe it doesn't get recorded till Monday, the property still conveys and all the money is calculated to the day of the settlement date, which would be, say, Friday. So make sure that your client understands that, right? You would be surprised at what people don't understand. They don't always correlate. I had a client one time. We had a settlement, say, for the 15th. I was preparing for settlement and everything, and about a week or so beforehand, I went by, and nothing in the whole place was moved yet. And I was like, hey, when are you moving? And he was like, oh, I paid the mortgage all the way to the 30th, so I plan to move out somewhere around the 27th. I was like, dude, we're going to settlement on the 15th, right? You're supposed to be out on the 15th. Well, I paid the mortgage all the way to the 30th. Don't I get to stay in the property to the 30th? No. Boy, did I feel bad. Fortunately, the buyers were very, we got an extension, everything was fine. But I was like, all right, little nugget in my little thing in my toolbox, right? From now on, I actually have to say, now you're moving out on the 17th, right? We're all moving on the 17th, right? Yeah. What else? Yeah. So paragraph 11 is your utilities. Make sure you fill in this section completely in regards to whether or not it's public or private water or sewage, whether or not the heat pumps. Normally what you get a lot of times is, and a bone of contention sometimes is if it's like people want gas appliances or people want gas heat. So make sure that the property that you're buying has the appropriate utilities, right? So there's nothing worse than checking gas, heat, and then going to do your home inspection to find out that the property is a heat pump. And your clients are looking at you like, well, we wanted gas. Why did we ratify on this? Well, the listing said it was gas, but when you went into the property, you got to make sure if your clients are adamant that they want gas, make sure that you look, because right, the big metal pipe that goes down to the heating system is an indication that it's gas, right? So make sure that you check the appropriate boxes. Paragraph 12 is your personal property and fixtures. This is just going to tell what's going to convey with the property. And some of the things I'm going to point out here is evident, but it says your existing and built-in heating, air conditioning equipment, plumbing, light fixtures, indoor, outdoor sprinkler systems, bathroom mirrors, right? Bathroom mirrors, right? It says that they're not going to take the mirrors, which has happened. Sub pumps, attics, exhaust fans, storm windows, doors, wall-to-wall carpeting, window shades, blinds, window treatment hardware, smoke and heat detectors, antennas, exterior trees, right? You don't want your clients digging up their trees, right? And shrubs. So then also note that smart home devices installed, wired, or attached to personal property or fixtures conveyed pursuant to this paragraph included but not limited to smart switches, smart thermostats, smart doorbells, and security cameras. Do convey. So if they have like Ring cameras, all that kind of stuff, all conveys now, right? So make sure your clients understand that. In today's day of electronic signing, sometimes we don't have these conversations anymore with our clients so that they aren't totally up to speed in regards to what's supposed to stay with the property. Whether if they have an electric vehicle charging station, that's supposed to convey. If they have solar panels on the roof, those are supposed to convey, and there's a separate addendum for that, right? So make sure that you have that in there. All surface or wall-mounted electronics do not convey. So if I got a TV on the wall in every room, those TVs don't stay. However, the mounting brackets do. So you're supposed to leave the mounting brackets in the property, your seller is. So, and then you're supposed to check any other thing in here that's supposed to convey with the property. And then any as-is items or no additional item values, like say whatever is going to convey with the property, it has no additional value to the property, you would write those in there. And then if you have items that do not convey, like a recent listing I had, the entertainment center and the family room did not convey. It wasn't attached to the wall. We wrote it in as a do not convey item. And actually I put tags on the stuff inside the property so that everybody understood there were a couple items that did not convey, and we wrote them into the contract. If there's any fuel tanks on the property, you have to make sure that you denote that, and whether or not they're leased. This is very important, right? We have one going on now here as a Sampson buyer took possession of a property. They were told that the propane tanks were owned by the seller. The seller conveyed. All of a sudden, a couple months later, the propane company comes to fill up the tanks. They're like, hey, we're not using you. They said, what do you mean? These are our tanks. So guess what? They're leased tanks, and they're buried in the grounds now, or they're buried in the ground. So now there's a fight going on between the seller and the buyer because that wasn't disclosed that those were leased, and the contract actually says they're owned. So, oops. So make sure we know, and listing agents are like, well, I didn't know. I just went off of what the seller told me, right? So, and then you have leased items. Those would be denoted here that they are leased and who is the servicer. All right, we're going to wrap this up here, and we're going to finish. We're going to take up on paragraph 13 when we start back next Tuesday at 10 o'clock. Thanks for coming. Great seeing you. If you have any additional questions outside of this, feel free to ask. All right, thanks.